When a narcissist slips, it isn't dramatic, but it's irreversible. It's usually a small moment, a contradiction they don't catch, a reaction that doesn't match the mask, a flash of entitlement where empathy was supposed to be, and in that moment, something locks into place inside you. You don't question it. You don't debate it. You don't need proof. You see. This is the moment people struggle to explain, because it doesn't feel emotional. It feels cognitive, like a pattern snapping into focus. The tone doesn't match the words. The story doesn't match the behavior. The mask slips just long enough for you to glimpse what's underneath. And once you see it, the narcissist feels it immediately. Not because you said anything, but because your energy changes, your reactions flatten, your curiosity disappears, your empathy stops reaching for them. That shift is everything. Narcissists survive on the assumption that confusion protects them, that doubt keeps the mask intact, that as long as you're questioning yourself, they're safe, but clarity is lethal to the performance. This is why the slip matters so much. It isn't the mistake itself. It's the realization that follows. You're no longer trying to understand them. You're observing them. And the moment you move from participant to witness, the dynamic breaks. They may continue talking. They may double down. They may try to correct the image, but it's already too late. Because now they know something has changed. They know you saw the gap. They know you noticed the inconsistency. They know the mask didn't fully hold. This is where narcissistic collapse begins, not with confrontation, not with exposure, but with awareness, the kind that doesn't argue, doesn't accuse, doesn't need confirmation, just quiet certainty. In the next chapter, we'll break down what happens when you see behind the mask, and why that single moment makes every future performance unstable. When you see behind the narcissist's mask, the most unsettling part isn't what you discover, it's how calm you become. There's no explosion of anger, no dramatic confrontation, no urge to prove anything. The confusion simply ends. You realize the personality you were responding to was never stable. It was assembled, responsive, conditional, and the narcissist feels the shift immediately, not because you accuse them, but because your reactions stop reinforcing the structure holding the mask in place. You stop leaning forward emotionally. You stop offering nuance. You stop filling in the gaps for them. That's when their behavior starts to look exposed. The charm lingers too long. The empathy arrives a moment late. The concern feels rehearsed. You notice how often they redirect instead of reflect. How rarely they sit with accountability. How quickly irritation appears when control isn't restored. This is where collapse accelerates. Because the narcissist depends on one thing above all else: your uncertainty. As long as you doubt yourself, the mask can adapt. As long as you stay emotionally engaged, the performance can recalibrate. But once you know, without needing proof, the illusion destabilizes. You're no longer inside the interaction. You're watching it. And being watched is intolerable for a narcissist. They begin to overcorrect. They explain too much. They switch tones too fast. Not because they're careless, but because the performance has lost its anchor. They sense it. You're no longer confused, and confusion was their shield. Seeing behind the narcissist's mask doesn't make you aggressive. It makes you still. And stillness is the first thing a narcissist cannot perform against. In the next chapter, we'll break down why the narcissist knows you know, and how that awareness triggers the panic that leads directly to collapse. When a narcissist realizes you see them clearly, something shifts behind their eyes. It's subtle, a pause that lasts a second too long, a smile that doesn't fully form, a flicker of calculation where confidence used to be. They feel it, not because you confronted them, not because you exposed them publicly, but because your energy changed. You're no longer reacting the same way. You're no longer absorbing the narrative. You're no longer reaching for reassurance. You're observing. Up until this moment, they believed the mask was working. They believed the confusion was intact. But now, something is off. Your questions are different. Your silence lasts longer. Your responses don't chase resolution. That's when it lands for them. You see the pattern. And once a narcissist realizes the illusion has been recognized, they cannot unknow it. This is the beginning of internal panic, not the loud kind, not rage yet, a quiet destabilization, because the power dynamic depended on one assumption, that you were unsure. When certainty replaces doubt, control starts to erode. They begin scanning for weaknesses, testing your tone, probing for emotional entry points. A joke that used to disarm you, a memory meant to soften you, a subtle shift in blame, but none of it lands. And that's when their composure tightens. You can almost feel it. They're trying to determine how much you know, how clearly you see it, whether this is temporary or permanent. This is the most uncomfortable position a narcissist can be in, because they cannot directly ask. They can't say, "Did you figure me out?" So they watch you the way they used to watch everyone else, except now the roles are reversed. And that reversal is intolerable. The moment they know you know is the moment the mask becomes unstable. From here, collapse isn't emotional, it's structural. In the next chapter, we'll break down the panic that follows exposure, and why the narcissist begins cycling tactics faster and with less precision once they realize the performance is compromised. When the narcissist realizes the performance is compromised, panic doesn't explode. It accelerates, not outwardly at first, internally. You'll see it in the tempo. They respond faster, interrupt more, shift tone mid-conversation, over-explain what never needed explanation. The narcissist can tolerate conflict. They can tolerate distance. They can tolerate criticism. What they cannot tolerate is being clearly seen. When you were uncertain, they could maneuver. When you were emotionally invested, they could recalibrate. But now you're steady. Your silence is intentional. Your reactions don't provide feedback. That stillness forces something they fear. Improvisation without guidance. So they start cycling. Charm returns abruptly, then guilt, then defensiveness, then nostalgia, then subtle intimidation. It happens faster than before, less precision, more force, because the performance is losing its rhythm. This is the escalation phase. They're not trying to hurt you, they're trying to regain structure. A narcissist under exposure doesn't collapse emotionally first. They scramble strategically. They test which mask still works, which tone still penetrates, which tactic still moves you. But nothing lands the way it used to. And that's when the panic surfaces. You may see irritation flash through their composure. You may notice a crack in their confidence. They sense the shift too. They know something irreversible has happened. You're no longer inside the illusion. You're outside it. And when the audience steps off stage, the performer loses leverage. This is why their movements start to feel erratic. They're no longer adapting from control. They're reacting from exposure. And exposure is destabilizing because it cannot be negotiated. You either see it or you don't. And once you do, the narcissist cannot perform the same way again. In the next chapter, we'll break down how the narcissist tries to recover control and why every attempt starts failing faster once the collapse has begun. When a narcissist feels control slipping, they don't accept it, they counterattack. Not physically, not dramatically, strategically. The moment they sense exposure, they begin searching for leverage. They return to what used to work. Charm resurfaces. Sudden vulnerability appears. Apologies arrive that sound almost convincing. Not because they're remorseful, but because they're recalibrating. If softness doesn't restore access, they pivot. Guilt enters the room. You've changed. You're distant. You're not the same person. This isn't confusion, it's repositioning. If guilt fails, they escalate further. Subtle intimidation, sharpened tone, rewriting events in real time. They are scanning for something, anything that reestablishes imbalance. Because imbalance is where control lives. But here's what changes everything. You aren't reacting anymore. You aren't defending yourself. You aren't chasing resolution. You aren't trying to repair what you now understand was a performance. That's when recovery attempts start failing faster. The apology feels hollow. The guilt feels transparent. The aggression feels desperate. You see the tactic before it fully forms. And that predictive awareness destabilizes them more than confrontation ever could. A narcissist can argue. They can deny. They can escalate. What they cannot handle is being anticipated. When you respond calmly to what used to confuse you, they feel exposed in a new way. Their tactics don't just fail. They look obvious. And once tactics become obvious, they lose power permanently. This is the turning point. They realize you're no longer trying to make sense of them. You're studying the pattern. And when the pattern becomes visible, the illusion collapses in layers. In the next chapter, we'll examine why every tactic begins failing faster, and how the narcissist starts revealing more in desperation than they ever did in control. When the narcissist realizes their usual tactics aren't landing, something unsettling happens. They speed up. Not smarter, faster. The charm that once unfolded gradually now appears abruptly. The apology that used to sound measured now sounds rushed. The guilt that once lingered now feels forced, because collapse creates urgency. Up until this point, their methods worked because they were spaced out, calibrated, timed carefully. But exposure disrupts timing. Now they don't know what you believe, how much you see, or whether the mask is salvageable. So they begin cycling. Charm, guilt, victimhood, anger, one after another. Not because they're evolving, but because they're scrambling. This is where the performance begins to reveal its limits. A stable identity would slow down under pressure. reflect, reassess. A narcissist accelerates. They test every door at once, and the faster they move, the more visible the pattern becomes. You start predicting the shift before it happens. You feel the tone change before the words arrive. You recognize the script before the sentence finishes. And that predictive awareness is destabilizing for them, because now they are not influencing you. They are reacting to you. That reversal creates visible strain. You may notice contradiction within a single conversation. Promises undone minutes later. Emotion that feels theatrical instead of authentic. They aren't gaining control. They're losing coherence. And this is where something irreversible sets in. You stop taking anything personally. The attack doesn't sting. The charm doesn't soften. The silence doesn't punish. Everything becomes data. And once you start observing instead of absorbing, the narcissist feels it. They sense the loss of impact. They sense the diminishing effect. They sense the collapse. This is the phase where desperation begins to override discipline, where control gives way to exposure. And once that shift happens, the collapse is no longer avoidable. In the next chapter, we'll examine the desperation phase, when the narcissist overplays their hand completely, revealing more in panic than they ever did in calm. When the narcissist realizes the usual tactics aren't working, desperation replaces discipline. This is where collapse becomes visible. Up until now, everything had rhythm, measured charm, controlled guilt, calculated distance, but desperation has no rhythm. It overreaches. You'll notice it first in the intensity. They say too much, promise too much, accuse too much. The emotional volume rises. What once felt strategic now feels chaotic, because they're no longer managing perception. They're trying to stop the fall. This is when the narcissist overplays their hand. They contradict themselves in ways that are impossible to ignore. They expose private motives accidentally. They escalate small disagreements into dramatic standoffs, not because they've lost intelligence, because they've lost composure. Composure depends on control, and control depends on your participation. But you're not participating anymore. You're steady, neutral, unmoved, and that stillness forces something terrifying for them. Improvisation without leverage. So they push harder. They might attempt one final grand gesture, or one final accusation, or one final attempt to reframe the narrative. But instead of restoring power, it reveals fragility. You begin to see something unmistakable. The person who once felt dominant now feels unstable. The persona that felt composed now feels frantic. Desperation exposes structure, and once you witness it clearly, the illusion doesn't just weaken. It collapses. You don't need to argue. You don't need to explain. You simply watch as the performance loses coherence. And the more they try to regain control, the more obvious it becomes that control was never stable to begin with. In the next chapter, we'll break down what happens when the performance fully collapses, and how the narcissist becomes aware that the exposure is permanent. When the narcissist understands the mask isn't working anymore, something breaks internally, and it doesn't repair. This is not dramatic. There's no confession, no admission, no sudden self-awareness. It's quieter than that. The tone changes, confidence tightens, charm becomes mechanical, silence feels heavier. They begin to realize something irreversible. You are not confused. You are not emotionally entangled. You are not persuadable. And that awareness creates a collapse that isn't emotional, it's structural. Because once someone sees the pattern clearly, the performance cannot return to its original state. The narcissist may continue speaking. They may attempt composure. They may act as if nothing has shifted, but internally they know. They know you saw it. They know you recognized the contradiction. They know you felt the manipulation before it fully formed. And that knowledge destabilizes them in a way confrontation never could. When exposure becomes permanent, the illusion becomes fragile. Every move now feels forced. Every attempt feels transparent. Every tactic feels late. This is the point where collapse stops being about recovery. It becomes about damage control. They may retreat. They may lash out. They may attempt one final narrative rewrite. But the energy is different now. It's no longer confident control. It's containment. And here's the most important part. You don't need to say anything. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need closure. Because collapse doesn't require an audience. It happens the moment clarity locks in. If this series is resonating with you, it's because you've experienced this shift firsthand. You felt the moment where confusion turned into certainty. That's what we break down here on the Silent Regime channel: the patterns, the psychological structures, and the quiet shifts that end the game without confrontation. If you value clarity over chaos and strength over reaction, consider subscribing. Because once you understand collapse, you stop fearing it. And once you stop fearing it, you stop being controlled by it. In the next chapter, we'll examine the narcissist's awareness that it's over. The moment they understand, the exposure isn't temporary, and there is no repairing the mask you've already seen through. When the narcissist realizes the collapse isn't temporary, something in them goes quiet, not peaceful, resigned. They stop trying as hard. The tone softens, not from humility, but from recognition. They understand the exposure isn't a phase. You're not in a mood. You're not confused. You're not coming back into the illusion. And that's when it settles in for them. You're gone psychologically, not physically. Not necessarily loudly, but internally, you've stepped out of the structure that once gave them leverage. They can feel it. The conversations don't grip you. The guilt doesn't pull you. The nostalgia doesn't soften you. And when none of it works, something destabilizing becomes clear to them. There is no repairing the mask once it's been seen through. That's the part collapse hinges on. A narcissist can survive conflict. They can survive distance. They can even survive exposure to others. But they cannot survive being permanently reclassified in your mind. Once you stop seeing them as powerful, complex, or misunderstood, and start seeing them as predictable, reactive, and hollow, the dynamic changes forever. And this is where I want to pause for a moment. If you've lived through this, if you've felt that moment where clarity replaced confusion, understand something important. You didn't become cold. You became aware. You didn't turn your back on someone struggling. You recognized a pattern that was costing you your peace. That recognition takes strength most people never develop. It takes endurance to sit through gaslighting. It takes resilience to survive the cycles. It takes courage to finally trust your perception. If you're here, it's because you did that. You endured the confusion long enough to see the structure underneath it. That's not weakness. That's growth. And the fact that you can now observe instead of absorb means the collapse didn't just happen to them. It freed you. In the final chapter, we'll break down why collapse is permanent and what happens when the narcissist understands there is no second act waiting for them. When the narcissist understands there is no way back in, the performance dies. Not dramatically, not explosively, quietly. This is the part no one talks about. After the exposure, after the cycling of tactics, after the failed guilt, the failed rage, the failed nostalgia, there comes a moment where they recognize something irreversible. You are no longer emotionally reachable. You're not angry. You're not reactive. You're not waiting for closure. You're finished. And when a narcissist realizes the audience has permanently left the theater, the performance has no oxygen, that's the true collapse. It isn't screaming. It isn't begging. It isn't even always visible. It's the internal understanding that the control structure has collapsed beyond repair. They may try one last subtle reach, a casual message, a small reminder of history, but beneath it is awareness. They know you saw behind the mask. They know you will never unknow what you now understand. And that is permanent. Because once someone is redefined in your mind as predictable manipulation rather than complex mystery, they cannot return to myth. This is where the narcissist faces something they rarely confront. Consequences that cannot be negotiated. They cannot outtalk it. They cannot outmaneuver it. They cannot outlast it. You became still. You became observant. You became unreachable. And when you became unreachable, the structure that depended on your reaction collapsed. If you've walked through this, if you felt that shift where confusion turned into clarity, and clarity turned into silence, understand something. You didn't win by humiliating them. You won by withdrawing the illusion. You didn't destroy them. You stopped feeding the performance, and that's power. This channel isn't about rage. It's about awareness. It's about sovereignty. It's about understanding the structure so thoroughly it can never trap you again. The narcissistic collapse isn't loud. It's final. And once it happens, there is no second act, only consequence.